Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by White House reporter Naomi Lim. Naomi, the president, has taken a trip abroad. He's since come back. The war in Ukraine is a year old now. What sort of did he get from his trip to Europe, and where do things stand?
So Biden has just returned from a 4-day trip to Europe, which, as you sort of alluded to, contained a secret trip to the capital, Kyiv of Ukraine, which is sort of kind of remarkable in a sense that it's a war zone and the US has a very light military footprint in the country. In fact, I think it's only like a couple of service members outside the embassy. The trip also sort of contained a speech in Poland, which was to a crowd of sort of 30,000 people, as well as broadcast around the world, as well as sideline meetings with, I think, the Moldova leader, as well as the Bucharest Nine and the Polish president, all of those sort of eastern flank NATO allies. If the aim of the trip was to sort of reassure allies, present a united front that they were still supported Ukraine in this war against Russia, I think he succeeded, minus sort of the little stumble that he had on coming aboard Air Force One on the way back, and a little bit of an awkward moment with the Polish president where he sort of made a joke about Polish last names. He succeeded.
And a little too much Coldplay.
A little bit too much Coldplay, exactly.
Yeah, they're more Nickelback fans in
the
Eastern
audience.
Europe. Yeah.
But it was a really good trip. But as you sort of alluded to, sometimes when you do something, there's always criticism, and part of that was the tone of the speech that he gave. It came across as a little bit more celebratory when Ukraine is bracing for what could be a spring offensive and a difficult time in the war. Other criticism that he's received is that he was over there in Europe when the folks in East Palestine, Ohio, were dealing with a toxic chemical spill from a train derailment. So there were some wins and some losses, but I think really if the White House was looking at some of the images that came out of particularly that Kyiv trip, they would have put that in the W column.
Sure. So speaking of things that they might want in the W column, obviously Democrats would like to win the 2024 presidential election. The assumption has been that the nominee would be President Joe Biden. The primary calendar has all been revised to really smooth the path for President Biden. He talks like a candidate. Why are people sort of whispering about whether he's going to run or not? He hasn't declared as we're filming this.
Well, he's talking, as you said, like a candidate, but he's not quite walking as a candidate just yet. Now, Biden is sort of known for having a very protracted decision-making process. We saw that play out in 2016. We see that play out day to day when it comes to sort of policy decision-making. And now we're seeing that again. And I think what's happened was a lot of speculation, strategic leaks from the White House that we would expect an announcement soon after the State of the Union address. Obviously now we're turning the calendar into March, which means a February launch date is basically off the books.
Not really happening.
No, and so now the most likely date is April, one that has an advantage of fundraising deadline disclosures. There's also sort of historical precedent when it comes to an April launch date. The problem is that with this sort of waiting game, aides sort of are not quite, they're sort of playing this dance in terms of how they do the campaign structure, how they form it, and then it also, like, if there needs to be a plan B, it's sort of sideline sort of potential primary opponents. Now, as you said, like, there's pretty much a glide path if the president was to announce to become the nominee again. He had the Democrats outperformed expectations in the midterms. He now has got that clean bill of health from his White House physician.
Other than saying he doesn't quite walk like a candidate in the same way he once did.
Exactly. And so there are all these indications that he will. I think that just a lot of the chattering class in DC were talking about it as a given, his announcement as a given, and that decision hasn't formally been made, even though everything points toward it happening very soon.
And things seem to be coming into place. Now, if he weren't to run, if he decides against it for some reason, some of the people who might be waiting in the wings don't look quite as appealing. And so we've kind of rehearsed vice president's problems over and over again. But one name that keeps coming up is Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Maybe not so much anymore?
So Secretary Pete Buttigieg has, we've seen sort of having 2024 aspirations.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was this idea that maybe it was an unusual position for him to be a transportation secretary, even though his being a mayor of a small town sort of leads to credentials in that regard.
Sure.
There was this perception that it would be a cushy job, and I think we're seeing that that's not quite the case, because if you're a transportation secretary and you're in the news, you're probably not doing a great job.
It's like the NFL kickers of cabinet positions. You really are only noticed when you miss.
I'm going to have to trust your opinion on that,
You're
because
gonna have
sport is very, is very hard for me.
Sport ball.
Yeah,
Go
exactly.
local sports team and or college.
Sports, yay. But then I think, so we're seeing this pattern of issues that Pete Buttigieg has had to deal with. We've sort of seen him also be away when things have become difficult. For example, he was on paternity leave when the supply chain crisis was sort of at its peak during the pandemic. He was also away in Portugal on a personal trip during the railway workers' negotiations with the labour unions. And then we're sitting now where he was stopped outside his house, and to be fair, he had done a lot of interviews that day, but he was asked about the Ohio rail derailment, and he sort of said, I'm on my personal time.
Right.
And then he is in Ohio. He did visit Ohio, the site, and was asked again by reporters there, just simple questions, and his press secretary intervened. So it's not good optics for somebody that has aspirations for higher office.
Yeah, I mean, this was supposed to sort of be what put him in a better position than being mayor of South Bend, which is a fairly small city, not New York City. But now there's a lot of questions about, does he really have sort of the presentation and the personality and maybe the interactions with the media that would be necessary really for a winning campaign?
Right, and I mean, that hasn't precluded people in the past. I feel like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis also has that criticism where he's not great politicking in that retail politics kind of way, but he can project himself through speeches and media interviews, etc. Now maybe Pete Buttigieg is very good in front of a camera, particularly through media outlets that have typically been or perceived as being hostile towards Democrats. But I think maybe the day-to-day personable, feeling empathy. I mean, that's something that he also struggled with on the campaign trail in 2020. So I think we're seeing similar problems rear their ugly heads all over again.
Thank you, Naomi. You can read Naomi and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.